Thanks, Robin. Pleasure to be here. I think the last panel stole a bit of the thunder that I was preparing around Berlin. So what I'd like to do is just add a little bit of value on top of that from a venture capital company. Most of you know Earlybird, so I'll spare you our pitch. But what I would like to do is give you a little perspective from VCs in Berlin and what's going on from the, I guess, capital scene. So a lot of you are in the ecosystem. A lot of you are in kind of this long cycle of fundraising. It doesn't only start, obviously, with new companies, but it goes on to the guys who fund the companies at seed level. You see a lot of entrepreneurs also on the stage today who are first, second, or third-time wealth creators, recycling their money and brains back into the ecosystem. Take that a step further, and you have more the institutional investors, and those are usually early-stage VC companies that raise funds from guys that are called limited partners. These are family offices, they're fund of funds, they're pension plans, they're endowments, and they're all over the world. As most of you know, over the last probably 15 years since the whole venture ecosystem got kicked off in Germany, there has been, since the year 2000, a pretty large capital deficit. One of the reasons why is most of the investors who came into Germany in the bubble time lost their pants and their shoes and their underwear. I mean, they basically are still running towards the woods, and they haven't come back to venture. So what's happened is over the last 6, 7 years, most of the institutional venture investors have had to go back and raise money from completely new sources. They're going to the Middle East, going to Japan, going to the US, et cetera. I mean, Earlybird is an example. In our third fund in 2007, we had to completely refresh our investor base. So now, we have a number of family offices, pension plans, banks, endowments, you name it. So brand new from our earlier two funds. What's happened also since then, obviously, is that investors have become more savvy. Those that are in the game today are very differentiated. They want also to see differentiated stories, and it's not a storytelling exercise. They want to see metrics. So these people typically were investors themselves privately when they got into private equity. So they know the story, they know tech, they know the entrepreneurs, especially in the US. So when we start talking about Berlin, they start getting a little bit more exciting, not because of marketing pitches, et cetera, but because of what they've seen over the last 6 or 7 years being created here. And I know we're going to get back to the story about entrepreneurs and why Berlin is a sexy spot right now. But what we are looking at as investors is to try to ensure that that's sustainable. One of the main ways to do that is try to bring capital into Berlin, right? We think it'd be a shame to have like these 5 or 6 clusters like you used to have, where Munich was strong in software, Hamburg was just gaming, and Berlin some internet. Now we'd like to see everything focus in Berlin where there's a critical mass. So over the last, especially 3 years, we've been bringing a lot of investors who aren't just in our fund or who aren't even in our fund to get them a taste of what's going on in Berlin. So we'll bring them to some of the business builders, right, to these like 10 or 11 people who have between 1,000 and 10,000 employees up to $1 billion plus, moving among all of their companies. Then we kind of bring them to the companies that you've seen earlier today that already reached what Felix called that magical peak, where suddenly they've become visible above the Berlin and German and even European ecosystem because of their metrics, right? They've simply attracted a lot of users. They've attracted a lot of revenue. And they're starting to attract a lot of capital. But that capital is what we call growth stage capital, right? Those are companies like Kleiner, Venrock, Sequoia. They have billion-dollar-plus funds, so they can quickly deploy $20+ million in something where they're pretty sure they're going to get a 10+ X on their investment. So bringing us back down to Berlin, and what we're trying to do, we're trying to ensure that there's an ecosystem that's being created. We already know the seed, getting seed stage funding it's not easy, but let's say it's much easier than it probably was 4 or 5 years ago. And we'd like to help free up that bottleneck at what's called early stage, because we still think there's a bottleneck, because as many of you know, early stage is usually done locally. So if you pick up the phone right now and call Andy Bechtelsheim's venture capital firm in the Valley, talk to one of their 3 partners, They're going to tell you they've never done a deal within, outside of a 50-mile radius. So you're like, well, shit, I'm here in Berlin, and I'm trying to be global. So what we're trying to do is ensure that we can encourage even more funds, because our investors, and just to bring you back down to the whole story about why Berlin is so interesting, our investors want to ensure that when we are investing in Berlin, we can find syndicates, right? We can find syndicates moving down the road, because if we're investing in company A, and they're going to be moving to the US in 6 months and scaling like bananas, they want to make sure that you've got other investors in your syndicate that can help you with their brains and their network, right? So that's why it's rarely, when you look at some of the star VCs that have emerged since 2004 in the US, like Union Square, Spark, Foundry Group, et cetera, you're always going to see in their next round a broader syndicate. Sure, a lot of them continue with the whole investment cycle to exit, but these syndicates are there for a reason, because early stage companies typically don't have billion-dollar funds. It's simply, the math simply doesn't work if you want to return at a fund level of 100 or 200 million euro, 4, 5, 6+ X return. So with that, I think I've used my small 5-minute allocation, but like I said, I didn't want to repeat and proselytize too much on what I think most of you already know about what's happening in Berlin. I wanted to approach it from the capital perspective on how we can encourage more early stage capital flowing into this market, so that we get an ecosystem that, again, as one of the speakers just before us mentioned, is kind of a self-starter, right? This isn't like Angela Merkel standing up like Putin and saying, we're going to repurpose $4 billion for Berlin to create the Silicon Valley of Europe. No, it's simply happening, and it's happening for a good reason, and we're going to talk about that in our panel today, which is about internationalization of Berlin with startups at the heart. And now I'd like to introduce another panel member who will come on with us in just a second from Airbnb, Gunnar Fro. Please give him a small round of applause.